Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me as always are my fabulous co-hosts.
Hello, Rob. It's me, Diana Perry Cruz. Hi.
And it's me, Mimi Jackie.
Jackie Perry Cruz as well.
Jackie Perry Cruz. I've decided to change my name, much to the chagrin of my family.
We'll be like the Partridge Family, you know? They all fake, we're like a TV
Okay,
family.
so it was recently Rob's birthday.
It was.
And I posted a thing.
Possibly not when this episode comes out.
Well,
recently,
not
within the
that
last
long ago. It was Rob's
month.
birthday. And I posted a thing on the internet to say happy birthday to you. Mm-hmm. And someone wrote in and said, "Oh, yay, the second funniest host."
Oh.
And I said, "Who's the funniest one?" And they said, "The one who sings her name."
Yes! That's me!
So that's you. So I got third place.
Only second funniest. I don't know. I disagree with that assessment.
I wholeheartedly agree with it. Thank you. That's why you guys have me here. I mean, marriage is not funny, and that's why I come in to play.
That's true. Yeah, because we're always airing our marriage grievances on the show. But surprise, this isn't a podcast about marriage counseling or even a humor podcast. So it doesn't really actually matter who's the funniest of us all. It's a podcast, a very serious podcast about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research, where every week we pick a topic and discuss relevant research articles. And this week we are going to be talking more about ableism, which we've done an episode about ableism in schools. This is an episode about ableism as a product of the medical model of disability, which pretty much all of us in the field, unless you are only working in, say, maybe OPM or maybe exercise and health or physical fitness and health, is probably a component of that medical model. So we're going to be discussing what the medical model is. We're going to be talking about how it does, or maybe does not, but mostly does, promote the idea of ableism and what we can do about it, especially since we're kind of in the middle of being part of a medical model. So, Diana, what articles will we be discussing today?
Yeah, so we have two articles that we're going to review as part of our discussion today, and they include Deficit Difference or Both, Autism and Neurodiversity by Kapp, Gillespie-Lynch, Sherman, and Hutman, and that was published in Developmental Psychology 2012. Also, Applied Behavior Analysis and the Abolitionist Neurodiversity Critique and Ethical Analysis by Graeber and Graeber. That was in Behavior Analysis and Practice 2023.
Okay.
Does that make you want to say Marley and Marley? We're Marley and
Oh.
Whenever I read, I'm like, we're Graeber and Graeber.
No, that's too many jumps.
Yep.
Oh, Jackie gets it.
I actually got that one.
I understand the reference. I just...
Okay.
there's a reason some of
Rolls
us
off
have
the
the
tongue.
rankings that some of our listeners report, I suppose. Ouch. All right. So we're
You know what Tracy Morgan told me personally?
Tracy Morgan, the comedian Tracy Morgan?
Yeah. In the SNL recap is that you don't have to be funny for other people. You just have to be funny for yourself. And if other people find you funny, and then that just means that they appreciate your humor, but your humor is for you.
Okay. Wise words. Would you like to continue wise words with talking a little bit about what ableism is, if folks are not familiar with the term?
No, I have to go audition for SNL.
And she will right now because she's wearing a mushroom hat. I wish it was videotaped.
You're just doing some like prop comedy over here.
Yeah, you want me to get started?
No, please continue with the type 5 about your mushroom hat.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I can totally do that. So in the not too distant past, we talked about ableism, and I believe I'm going to tell you, of course, at the end in the context of pairings, but I think that was episode 295 where we talked about ableism and in the context of schools. However, in the course of having that conversation, we said, we probably should just back up and talk about ableism more generally, not solely in the context of schools. So that's how we ended up at this episode. So if you are unfamiliar, you could rewind and go back and listen to that episode first.
Let's cut down the response effort and just tell them now.
Okay, I could also do that. So when we talk about ableism, I find the best way to succinctly summarize it is saying it is discrimination based on one's ability/disability. So ableism is just like other isms in our society, which would be racism, sexism, ageism, sizeism, right? It's bringing in a value about differences from what we would consider to be the quote-unquote norm, and viewing differences as less than or discriminated against. And this could be something that is occurring overtly, but it also could be something that is occurring covertly, and what we refer to that as systemically, right? So one could be unconsciously biased against a certain group just based on the socialization that has happened within your society. So it's not something that you have to consciously make an effort to be ableist, for example, or sexist, for example. But nonetheless, you could harbor some of those biases about groups who are different from you, particularly if you haven't had contact or experience or the opportunity to learn what living with that particular identity is like.
So this is definitely a topic. When we discussed it in the context of schools, I think we all felt very comfortable talking about it. I think we had some really good discussions about it. There was something about looking at it through the lens of the medical model of disability that I really struggled with. Reading these articles, sometimes we read a couple other background articles, just, as we're trying to find, what are going to be the best ones to bring to the show. And there was just something about it that, I don't know, it gave me pause. Not so much the idea of, let's support ableism. Wow, I'm shocked. Nothing like that, because I think we were very clear about not wanting to promote ableist practices in that last episode and in most episodes, I think, that we do of the show. But just something about kind of an intractability when we look at it from this model that many of us have been working in for a long time. Very differently than a number of other sort of processes, I think, when we've talked about sort of these interlocking social systems.
I think what you're saying is that when viewing it in terms of the challenges between what we're going to get to as the neurodiversity model or the social model of disability versus the medical model of disability, the challenges that we see in that critique really come at a foundational level to behavior analysis, and then, even expanding out from there to really psychology as a whole. Mm-hmm. So it is challenging in that regard, because it's not looking at one little tweak, perhaps, right? It's really thinking about it at its base. And sometimes there are some pretty long-standing differences or challenges between those two models that could be potentially difficult to reconcile. And that's what we're going to talk about.
Mm-hmm. And also, I always like to bring in, when we have this model, presumably the medical model that we are following, right? That also plays into how we treat others in the world and how we speak about others in the world based on the model that we're using. And I can see that play out, right, in how we treat those with developmental disabilities, and how that might be different if the world prescribed to the neurodiversity movement or the social model of disability, and how that would then affect how we look at people with disabilities and treat people with disabilities, right?
Yeah.
So it starts up with this this model, but then it filters into our day-to-day and how people that may not have a developmental disability perceive those with developmental disabilities.
Great.
Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit more about that medical model and social model. We'll kick it off, I think, with the Kapp et al. And I know, Jackie, you're leading most of that discussion on that article, but I think that gets into kind of the crux of what those types of models are for folks who aren't as familiar with them, in terms of being able to discuss them or having discussed them, and sort of discuss how that plays into reinforcing ableist practices, or doesn't in some cases.
Yeah. So the Kapp article was fairly interesting. I actually had to look up some words, which I felt hilarious. I was like, why don't I know this word? Amelioration.
Oh, that's a good word.
It is a good word.
I didn't know it. I had to look it up. It means improvement or bettering.
It always makes me think of Interview with a Vampire.
Why?
I think that they use that word in a soliloquy in the play that's happening within the movie.
Oh. Well, whenever I heard that word before, I thought it meant destruction. So the exact
the
opposite.
Yeah.
And so when I was reading this, I was like, these two words don't go together. I might need to look this up. So
just imagine Jackie going up to people with an angry face. I'm going to ameliorate the hell out of you. They're thank you.
You know what? I probably have said that in the world, and that is hilarious. But yeah. And so the Kapp article really looks at trying to reconcile the two differences between the medical model of disability and the social model of disability. And something that they did really interestingly is they did a survey, right? We all Love the survey.
So interesting.
We love the surveys, but what they did is that they said no study has done before. They used the
survey?
No,
I beg to disagree.
not that. But the questions that they asked weren't for a specific group, but for all of the community that's involved. So autistic individuals that were diagnosed, autistic individuals that were not diagnosed, parents, professionals, right? So it was everyone to see if the results would be similar. So they start off in their introduction, which I loved their introduction. If anyone needs like a good introduction on like the medical model versus the social model, it's only a few pages long, and it packs it in, right? So they said that in this current, in the current world, if there are differences that someone displays, that might lead them to not feel like they belong, and that may lead to loneliness. And so they said that many autistic individuals prior to the internet may have felt that way.
World Wide Web.
World Wide Webs. And so they, in the 2000s, which I forgot that MySpace was in the 2000s, but it was, which is crazy. But in the 2000s, autistic self-advocates generated or created the neurodiversity or autism rights movement as part of a way to take back their identity and to say that looking for a cure or a cause for autism was inappropriate because they're great just the way they am. And so this was in direct response to a lot of parent organizations starting organizations to find a cure for autism, ameliorate autism. Oh, no. See, I did it.
No, that's right.
Oh, it was?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Phew. And so...
Or at least ameliorate autism.
Actually, you could, the way that you
Right.
just use that, either of your definitions
we're right.
could work.
Yes, me.
But only one of them is the correct definition.
But we're not doing that to autism either way.
No. Right. So this study wanted to look at views related to autism elimination, which some parent support groups in the early 2000s wanted to get rid of autism. They wanted to cure it. Amelioration or the betterment or a celebration. So if you have autism, you may celebrate your strengths. So when we look at that, we have to look at how we're categorizing autism, and typically the medical model has been seen as incompatible with the neurodiversity movement, right? The medical model seeks to eliminate all of autism spectrum disorder or eliminate the symptomatology that would make someone appear less than typical.
Yeah, or that's like the sort of like the cascading effects, right of the medical model. Do you want me to jump in for 1 second?
You love to, so go for it.
Okay.
This is Diana's wheelhouse, so.
Yeah, so if we, we're working in behavior analysis, but that has stemmed out of psychology and psychiatry, and psychology and psychiatry stem out of the medical field more generally. Right?
Yep.
So specifically in the U.S. and for mental health issues, we have the DSM, and the DSM is structured much like any other medical journal or tome would be, in that you can come to the person who knows what they're talking about and say, hey, this is my list of symptoms, right? This is something I'm worried about. And regardless of what that, ultimate diagnosis is, the doctor is going to look through their books and say, you match up with this particular diagnosis.
We've all felt this anytime we've gone to the doctor, right? Yeah.
When they pull the big 5-inch book
like,
off the
"Let
shelf,
me
they're like, oh boy, I gotta look through here. Yeah. And so, the one is diagnosed with autism and receives an official medical diagnosis via this process in the US based on the DSM. So
United Kingdom, same way.
Okay. Well, there's also the ICD, but that's in Europe. So I'm going to tell you, I pulled out what the diagnostic criteria were, just so that we had like that point of comparison.
Sure.
So I'm quoting from the DSM here. And from the DSM, in order to meet criteria for autism, you need to have symptoms in both of these areas, area A and area B. So area A is persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across 3 contexts not accounted for by general developmental delays. And the 3 contexts are deficits in social emotional reciprocity, deficits in nonverbal communicative behaviors, deficits in developing and maintaining friendships. And then in part B, one needs to have restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities across at least 2 of 4 symptoms. These are the 4 symptoms. Stereotyped or repetitive speech, motor movements or use of objects, excessive adherence to routines, ritualized behavior, resistance to change. Number 3, highly resistant fixated interests. And number 4, hyper or hypo, so too much or too little, reactivity to sensory input, or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. So I'm just adding that in here so you can sort of like hear what that language sounds like, right? So if you were, listening to that, you heard me say again and again, deficit, deficit, deficit. So this is how the diagnosis comes to be, right? We're saying we don't see these things that we would quote unquote expect to see in a neuronormative population in social communication areas, and or we have potentially behavioral excesses, again, in ways that we don't expect to see in a neuronormative population related to restricted and repetitive behavior. So in both of those areas, it's like a big old checklist, right? These are things that I don't see you doing that I expect you to do. These are things that you do that I don't expect you to do, right? And it's sort of, that's how the diagnosis is created, right? It comes from this list of symptoms. So if you were to go to a medical doctor, right, and you're like, doc, I have this rash, and they look at the rash and they say, yep, it meets this criteria, this criteria, this criteria, looks to me like you have poison ivy.
I was like, what rash are you going to pick? It could be a variety of rashes.
Let's just say poison ivy, right?
Okay, that's a very benign one.
Right? You got poison ivy. I got a plan for you. We can fix this. I'm going to give you some calamine lotion and you're going to get all better and you will be quote unquote cured of your poison ivy, right?
Happened to me.
Yeah. And that works great for going to your MD. But if you're now going to your psychiatrist and saying, doc, I have these persistent deficits in social communication and these restricted repetitive patterns of behavior, they're going to pull out the big book and say, yep, looks like autism. Now, here's where the two models diverge. Yes, I was going to say unhitch, but diverge is better. Now, if we're following the medical model, it would say, this is what's going on. I got a plan for you, right? I can quote unquote fix this by having you do all these things and reduce the symptomatology, the same way you're going to reduce your symptomatology of your rash, right? Mm-hmm. And it just doesn't work that way, folks, right? It doesn't work like that. And we don't want it to work like that either. And the autistic community says the same thing. You can't take these symptoms out of the person because these behavioral presentations are not things to change about the person. They're part of who that person is in their core, right? The autism is not removable from the person. The person, it's hardwired in there, right? It's part of the neurotype. So the person's autistic. We're not ever going to take out that autism. And so that relates back to using person first versus identity first language as well. So the medical model is this idea. You have a list of symptoms. Let me fix those symptoms. We'll just excise that autism right out, right? And that can be contrasted with the social model of disability. You want me to keep going?
Yeah, you're on it. You're on the train, so.
Okay. Sorry. Then you can take back over.
That's fine.
Okay. Contrasted with the social model of disability. And with the social model of disability, we're not denying that people with disabilities may have a harder time in some aspects of the environment, but rather we're not looking at identifying that hardship as like living inside of the person and something that we need to change about the person, but rather looking at the interaction between the person and the environment that they are currently in and identifying what challenges they are experiencing related to the basically mismatch of the person with their environment. So are there ways in which we can make that person's experience in taking away what they want to take away from the current setting easier or better for them by making accommodations, modifications, or sort of challenges to the social order, basically, that can make the experience overall better for that person. Mm-hmm. Different people are going to have more or less disability in different settings, and making these accommodations may not fully make that person fully abled in that environment, right? But our goal should be striving for equity across experiences in whatever setting.
Yeah, and some of that thought process is sort of where things like universally designed either instruction or universally designed buildings come into play. The idea of, well, just because we've done one thing one way because the vast number of people who had the power to say, this is how I like it, or this seems fine to me, doesn't mean that is the only way that one can build a set of stairs or build a room or build an office space. And if only we changed it to be something that was more appreciated, appropriate for the vast majority of human beings across a wide variety of social spectrum and cognitive spectrums, physical spectrums, then that would just work for everybody. And then the disability would not vanish, but it certainly would not be impacted on any individual the same way it had been in the previous way.
Yeah, and the one thing that you're both missing, which I will include, is money. Right?
Yep.
And so the medical model and those opponents of the medical model, is that what I want to say?
Proponents.
The allies of the medical model really have been spending all of their money looking for a cure for autism, right? To figure out why autism is happening and a cure for, okay, if we can tweak these genes somehow, then we can...
Or apply this treatment.
We could
right? We can
change people that way.
Change people that way, right? The neurodiversity movement does not love that idea, right? Because they don't want to change who they are. Mm-hmm. And also they fear that it takes, there's two fears and they're valid. Number one, they are scared that if research does find a way to quote unquote cure autism, that people may use that as a genetic planning system and seek to get rid of, like if you're like, oh, look, we found this genome that your kid has, right? And then, you can like test for it, and now you're no longer going to have your child because of this genome. So that is a worry. And the second worry is that all of the money that's going toward all the research, there's just a ton, right? Going to find the causes and reasons why autism is actually taking away resources from the current people that need to learn things and to be, supported in the world.
Yeah.
So that makes sense, right? It makes sense there. And they do say that this article is like slightly positive for behavior analytic therapies. This is 2012. They're like, some neurodiversity people in the neurodiversity movement don't like ABA because they feel that we're rigid and that we're focusing on things that won't necessarily matter to the individual. But they say but ABA can be very helpful when it is done in collaboration with the participant and the caregivers, but more so the participant when you are helping them learn the skills and strategies that they want to learn to be part of the environment instead of us choosing such like stereotypy and eye contact, which they might not want to do. So I really loved that they added that in there, because I think when this is discussed, ABA is not always seen in that light that we actually can do some good. It just depends on how we're doing it. So I like that they brought that up in this article.
Yeah. Well, the vast majority of BCBAs and folks practicing in the field of autism, family support, autism treatment, which stems from work done, definitely part of the medical model to normalize autistic behavior.
Right.
So a lot of folks probably have been seeing, as a field, a lot of our growth did come from somewhat ableist practices, whether we planned on it or not. Now, we certainly can say, but that's like the 70s and 80s. We don't do that anymore. That's a long time ago. But at the end of the day, I still see Lovaas citations all the freaking time when people are talking about ABA and they just describe Lovaas, whatever.
Slapping kids' thighs.
The 90s, the 70s work, the 80s work, and they just describe that. Like, that's what you do, right?
87 was that
87, thank
article.
you.
Or people cite him as the father of ABA.
I hate that.
Yeah.
But again, what does it matter? If I tell someone that, they're like, oh, you're an ableist practice. No, that's not me. It's pretty weak. If someone has that opinion, that's a fair opinion in my saying.
Absolutely.
I don't do it that way is not going to help.
That's ultimately not that helpful, right?
Yeah.
To just attempt to defend yourself.
Say that's not me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm not going to tell you what the authors hypothesized, because I don't think it actually matters.
Okay.
What really matters, I think, is what they found.
Yeah.
So they did an online survey. And one thing I love about the online survey is that they did their work. Like, they posted all over Facebook and MySpace. I love that MySpace was a thing.
In 2012?
MySpace, I guess.
Huh.
It probably wasn't. It was published in 2012, but it probably wasn't done in 2012, right?
A few years before
that. And they
that.
also went to not every, but they said they went to many organizations that were self-advocacy organizations, parent-led organizations. They went to vocational settings. They went to secondary schools. They went to any place where anyone that could be identified autistic would be in California, and they sent the surveys. So they tried to get it both online and offline, but the survey was online. And they posited that, I guess this was a problem in 2012. This is not a problem now, right? Because surveys are only online now, but they're like, this is where people are. It's overrepresented. And I'm like, yeah, that's where people still are. So that's okay. But I like the justification. They felt bad. One of their limitations was that it was only done online.
Wow.
Oh my gosh.
Right? Because they're like, sometime we will have an offline one. I'm like, no need.
Yeah.
Yeah, no.
No need
Not anymore.
And then one thing I thought was a little bit sad is that, so they had participants, I'll tell you this first. They had participants ranging in age from 8 to 84. The mean was 32 years. There were more females than males. The education had a mean of 15.5 years, where one had 0 education, which I'm like, maybe that, where were, even the 8-year-old should have had some education. So I was just, when they were from 0 to, and I was like, 0?
Yeah.
Maybe they're unschooling. I don't know.
Maybe they misunderstood the question.
Yeah, maybe. And then there was very few minorities. Mostly everyone was white. They had those self-identified as autistic. And then they had more self-reported autistic traits on the autistic spectrum quotient than the non-autistics. They also had those with formal diagnosis. And they reported, which we all know from the literature, is that those that had a formal diagnosis of autism were reported fewer years of education and more unemployment, which we have seen. But the one thing that I was really sad about is that they asked for everyone's gender and they dropped the participants that were transgender and non-binary because they couldn't do an easy t-test. There wasn't enough of them.
Well, this study was 13 years ago.
Yes, I know. I don't know, but I'm just bringing it up because when I read that, I was like, oh, that because we know now that the majority, or not the majority, but many autistic individuals also identify.
Yes, and a higher percentage than
Right.
the neuro-majority.
Right. And so I was just sad that they were like, we can't use them, so we're going to drop them out. Yeah. Another thing that I really wish they would have done is in the appendix given us the questions. Because they didn't tell us if they were open-ended.
They're just focused on these are hypotheses, and here are questions that will kind of answer those questions.
But were they multiple choice? Were they short answer? Yeah. So the questions asked: relationship to autism. What's your relationship to autism? Are you diagnosed? Are you undiagnosed? Are you a parent of an autistic person? Are you a non-parent relative? Are you a friend? Are you a person without contact? But they didn't tell me if this is multiple choice or short answer. They just said SurveyMonkey, so it could have been both.
Yeah.
Right? So I don't know. Then they looked at the autism quotient and the number of autistic traits, right? Just to verify participants who ID'd themselves as autistic to see if they had more autistic traits than those that didn't. They had questions about neurodiversity, what was your definition? When did you become aware of it? And they also said in this one that there was non-critical definitions, and I didn't know what that meant. Rob, could you help me?
Non-critical. I don't know. I don't really remember that part.
I don't know if that meant they kept saying it over and over again, but I'm wondering if it meant critical definitions was the definition and non-critical was it kind of got to the definition. I didn't get that. So if the authors are listening, please write in and tell me what that meant because I didn't really know what that meant. Then they had questions about autism, do you person first or identity first? They asked what your emotions are. Do you have positive or negative terms? This one, they were here, we gave you all these emotions and you choose. Okay. So they told you there. It wasn't a fill in the blank. They asked their thoughts on the cause of autism. And they had a biological cause, other, environmental, social environment, right? The physical environment. They had the validity rejection, we shouldn't even be looking at it.
Yeah. The neurodiversity definition too. Yep. That you had to write in your own words because they talked about coding it as either positive description mixed or negative. Yeah.
So I would have loved to see the actual questions in an appendix. Or in a table, right? Because they were just here are the questions that we asked.
Yeah, and some clearly were not multiple choice, but some clearly were.
Yeah, so I was just confused.
And some were just listed as questions.
All right, so the results of the survey. It's a survey too, and I've also been thinking about survey data a lot recently, and I always ask myself, who fills out a survey? So
Right.
So I want to know from you guys, when you get surveys in your email, do you always fill them out?
Most of the time, but not always.
What about
No.
you? I never do.
Right.
I'm an instant deleter, so I'm sorry all you survey
There's a
participants.
great little cartoon that say the survey results are in, and 100% of people like to fill out surveys.
So yeah, like, but this lands me like, and they say this is part of the limitations too. Like, who are the people that wanted to fill this survey out, and what did they want to say, right? And
Right. Are they really positive about? Are they really negative?
right,
Right.
But where and they also said like, okay, we missed a huge group of autistic individuals that can't fill out this survey.
Absolutely.
Right. So that was a big limitation, I think, here.
Being online certainly is, and I think the number of autistic females, and they mentioned this in the limitations online, you're going to have a skewed sample in that 50% of, if the majority of people, autistic individuals who fill out your survey are female, you know for a fact that is not encompassing half of the autistic individuals in the country.
And it also would be interesting. I know what you're saying, because you're like, boys are 4 times as likely.
Yeah.
But
You got lost in the math.
Yeah, I know you did.
Yeah.
I saw your face.
I'm more of it in terms of like just the male, just thinking of a male female
Right.
binary.
But then
in that situation,
and two things that I want to bring up for that is, number one, you didn't have to have a formal diagnosis. So maybe, right, the females that are replying to the survey online were not formally diagnosed, but did meet all the criteria, right? But haven't gotten the diagnosis for whatever reason, right? Masking. Nobody wants to diagnose a female, those types of things. And I can't remember my second one. It'll come back in a little bit. But anyway.
Okay.
I digress. The results of the survey are... Autistic participants were more likely to be aware of neurodiversity. They found out about it online than non-autistic individuals, including parents. Which parents and kids are not talking, I guess.
yeah, like friends of autistic
knew.
individuals knew more about neurodiversity.
Yeah, but
according to
parents
the survey.
didn't.
No one wants to talk to their parents.
Yeah. Parents are like, I'm hip, I'm cool.
Yeah, they
Tell
call
me
them.
about
Let
it."
me tell you about the neurodiversity movement, Mom and Dad. It's probably more just like, how have you been? Haven't seen you in a couple weeks.
Yeah. So there was also, this is also not surprising, that more neurodiversity awareness was positively associated with more education, right? So with more knowledge comes more, I think, acceptance.
That makes sense.
So they were learning about neurodiversity online. Most respondents put uncritical definitions of neurodiversity. I don't really know what that means. Maybe it was like vague.
I mean, they looked at the
maybe they
valence
didn't- yeah.
of the words. So you're looking for words that are going to sound positive or
Oh,
negative.
then that is what it means.
Yeah.
You're
Okay.
right. Okay, because I was like, I do not know what this means, and you can't really look up the word uncritical in the dictionary because it's not there. Because I looked.
If you say awesome, it's a positive valence.
Oh,
If you
okay.
say
It's a valence. Okay, yeah.
Unawesome.
Okay, that
negative.
makes a lot more sense. I did not get that. So, there you go. So most respondents didn't have any critical definitions, right? It was never a positive or negative. But autistic people and friends of autistic people were more like to be aware of neurodiversity. But no one really had a problem with the neurodiversity movement. So that's great.
Yeah, that
right?
was in 2013. So you would like to think, although we would like to think things are progressing in a positive direction. I don't know if recent history would agree with that.
Truth. Okay, so being a parent of an autistic child was negatively related to the likelihood of rejecting validity of the question about the cause of autism. So this is different from the neurodiversity movement, but no other participant category associated with that. Usually people that had autism or self-identified as autistic associated with choosing a biological cause, and more education associated with endorsing an environmental component along with the biological cause, mixed multiple causes. So that's really interesting. They also said that, which we now know in the 2025s, is that autistic individuals prefer autistic individual than person with autism. Yeah, and so people that were aware of the neurodiversity movement endorse more positive emotions about autism than those that did not. Diagnosed and undiagnosed autistic individuals endorse more positive emotions about autism than not their non-autistic peers. And the diagnosed autism participants did not feel like it was important to find a cause. They felt that they should be using their money and resources elsewhere. And then they just said that there was no group differences in parenting practices. Everybody should be helping teach everyone what they need to know. So that was really good. Yeah. So then they go into talking about, you have a little note here. It says, does focusing on the biological model of autism allow protection from disability stigmas? Ask the authors.
I don't know why I wrote that. That's my note.
Yeah, that was your note. And I was like, I went to look back and look to see what the authors said. And they said that it might, right, if we had this biological model of autism, right, it's just biology, it might allow us more acceptance and understanding of autism, and less that it's the person's fault. Oh, that's what it was. Mm-hmm. Less that it's the person's fault.
Okay.
Oh, then it's just a component of like, well, that's who you are. So
right. And so it takes the onus off the person and saying like, you can rise above this disability, where if we had the biological model, it would offer more protection against that. That's where it was. I just got it too. I was going to ask you, but I didn't know.
Well, I wish I'd written a better note for myself.
And to tie it into ableism, right? It's like the view that disability is bad.
Right. So, yeah, I think that really is like the jux of the survey.
Crux.
I'm doing really good today on all of the words. I shouldn't talk. But it was just a survey, right? But it was a survey on what people thought. So it would be interesting to see if that changed now in the 2025s versus the 2012s. I know personally from working with our graduate students that the knowledge of the neurodiversity movement is much more broad.
Yes.
Than when I first started teaching in 2014, right? No one ever knew anything about
again,
that.
We're talking about graduate students. So I think in terms of limitations, the survey isn't targeting... I mean, I guess if the question is, what do people of a certain education level or people with certain relationships or familial relationships or friendships think about neurodiversity or know about neurodiversity, to ask, what does the average, American or European know about neurodiversity? What are their thoughts on it? Maybe online survey is not actually the most effective. Maybe you would need to go into places that have less... I mean, most places have pretty decent internet access. I think you just have to be more targeted as to where you presented the survey. To
maybe you go to doctor's offices, right? So during annuals, during their annual or exam, the doctor could be like, I have some questions for you that are unrelated to you, maybe.
I'd be a little scared if a doctor was like, let me ask you about neurodiversity. I'm like, what? It's a checkup, man. Like,
We have to do an informed consent.
Yeah.
So
do you want me to ask you a bunch of random questions and drag this appointment out even longer?
While you're sitting there in your underpants? Yeah.
With like a very thin
paper
sheet.
blanket.
Like, you're going to be cold. Here. If you sneeze on it, it will disintegrate. Okay, so I think future studies... They have some really good points in the future studies that I want to highlight that we should be doing.
The future is now.
The future is now. What we should still be doing, because I don't think we've done enough, is more I can't even say it.
Persistent?
No.
Parsimonious?
No, guys. Community action research.
Oh, participatory.
Participatory.
Good word.
Thank you. Research on asking what our participants actually want to know about themselves, right? Instead of us just going in as researchers and saying, I'm interested in this. I think you need to learn this skill, right?
Sure, yeah.
Doing a lot more of that study, because we're not doing a ton there, and I think we could do a lot better. And then looking at case studies across the lifespan, right? What you have as a child may be different than what you have as a teenager, as what you have as an adult. And we know that adult services is sorely lacking in where we're at.
Yeah.
And
more questions about adaptive functioning, or again, not that has to be the question, but working with your participatory, community to discuss like what is adaptive functioning, what types of services would be most helpful for the most people to reach a good level of adaptive functioning. Yeah, so move more into the how do we make life better for folks rather than
what do we think we need to do?
What do we need to change about you to make you yeah.
So that's what I think about that study, and it is from 2012, right? So. But Diana's going to tell us something that's more new.
Well, before that, I think we should take a little break, and then we're going to come back and shift gears a little bit. We'll be right back.
Hi. Do you want to be a BCBA, also known as a board certified behavior analyst?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Massachusetts to get your graduate degree, just minutes outside of Boston.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education, dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years.
And our 2022 graduates had a 92% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy approved fieldwork placements, ethics mini handbooks, PhD levels professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland if interested.
And don't forget, our program is accredited by the Association of Behavior Analysis International, or ABAI, as a Tier 1 master's degree program.
Don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu.
regiscollege.edu.
One more time, www.regiscollege.edu.
See you there.
Bye.
And we are back talking about ableism and the medical model of disability. But before we continue with our second article, I want to remind our listeners that ABA Inside Track is ACE and QABA approved. By listening to this episode, you're able to earn 1 learning credit, specifically with a focus on trauma. All you need to do is finish listening to the episode and then go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, or click the link in your podcast player to put in some information about you, including secret code words. And the first of those code words is fork, F-O-R-K. It is a table tool that you use to eat food. It has 4 tines usually. Maybe if you got a fancy fork, it's got less tines for salad or whatnot. It's great. Fork. All right, now let's get back to the show. So when we took our break, we were way back in the halcyon days, of 2012 and 2013, talking about neurodiversity as a movement that more and more people were aware of. But we are going to shift gears up to the present time to talk about Graeber and Graeber's review and critique. Well, is it a critique? It's a critique of the abolitionist neurodiversity critique of ABA.
I love this article, by the way. I heard someone talk about this article at a conference, and they went through it. I can't remember who it was.
Was it one of the Graebers?
It was Tyra Sellers, and it was a supervision.
Graeber and Grave.
It was a supervision. It was a supervision CEU. It was at Babbitt. It was a workshop. It was the workshop, and I got so excited about this article that I immediately, during the workshop, used my cell phone as a hotspot. And I never do this, and I downloaded the article and read it with such vigor.
Excellent. So, Diana, you're taking the lead on this article. The abolitionist neurodiversity critique is one of those terms that...
It's scary.
It uses a lot of big words, and I feel like it's one of those terms that I've looked up and then forgot about because I'm like, there's too many words. What are you trying to say? So I did appreciate this article for really wrapping it all together into enough information for me to remember what it is forever and ever from here on out. And I don't like it too much.
You don't like what?
I don't believe in abolitionist neurodiversity critique of behavior analysis. I don't agree with it. Oh no, I critique it. See, that's okay. Maybe I'm not as good with it as I thought. There's too many critiques.
Whenever it's something where it's like actually, I'm not even going to bother trying to say this because I can't even describe it. It's like when there's an article headline and it's like someone rejects something, like I can't process which side the things have landed on. Yes. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I'm really bad at that, especially if there's a word like critique in there and then you have to like sort through that. We can cut all that part out because
which part?
That's like a personal failing of mine.
Oh, okay.
What I just described.
Listeners, write in.
I'm going to instead try to talk about this article, which I also really, really like. Graeber and Graeber, I believe, they're married partner team, which we love.
Yep.
Right? And this was published in Behavior Analysis and Practice. They are, I believe, both practicing behavior analysts, although I could be wrong.
No, I think just one.
Just one of them is? Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. Yeah, so I wanted to talk about this article in the context of the discussion today and ableism in the medical model of disability, because this article really gets at the core of that, in that much of what we are asked to do as behavior analysts, at least historically, is address symptomatology of autism as it is listed out in those DSM criteria that I reviewed earlier. And it's viewed to be, a quote unquote success to ameliorate or decrease those symptoms on the checklist, right? I'm talking historically, right? But without any other additional thought really regarding whether it is a good idea to do so, right? So we see social communication deficits. Let's get those up, right? We see behavioral excesses in terms of rigidity or repetitive behavior. Let's get those down. And by doing either of those two things, we have quote unquote lessened the autism, right? And that is viewed as effective treatment. However, we need to take more of a nuanced look at understanding what all of this means, what it means for the folks who are the ones receiving these services, and what it means in the context of the medical model versus the social model of disability. So in their article, they go back, they talk about the disability rights movements of the 60s and 70s as distinguishing between disability as viewed as a quote unquote bad difference, which is like a hyphenated term in their paper, versus quote unquote a mere difference. So it's good to acknowledge difference, right? We don't have to all pretend to be the same abled in the same way we don't all need to pretend to be the same race or gender or religion. So recognizing and respecting folks' differences, also respecting that those differences play into your experience in the world, how you are perceived, how you perceive the world, and what your overall lived experience is like. So disability is just another one of these. However, due to ableist practices, we tend to see disability in our society as a bad difference rather than a mere difference. So if we're coming at this from a neurodiversity perspective, we want to be looking at autism as a whole as a mere difference. And then within that, there may be some challenges that someone experiences that they want individual help with, right? But just being autistic versus being neurotypical, that's a mere difference. It's not a bad difference. This is, again, in opposition to the medical model where there's deficits listed as what allows you to meet the criteria of the diagnosis, and making changes to the behavioral presentations is kind of thought of as the goal for that. This is stemming from the larger medical model that psychiatry is based in, so it's not a problem solely related to autism. The entire house of cards is built on this whole system here. So, Rob, I think that's why you're saying it's so daunting to thinking about this, because it's not something that changes very easily. But we as practitioners, as clinicians, can come into this with this type of understanding, right? And then allows us to be better, more compassionate, more nuanced clinicians. And the great thing about behavior analysis already is that it's individualized, right? We're going to be taking an individualized approach. This is just one of the factors that's going to contribute toward our decision making. So we're already in prime position to do a good job at this. And I have a couple quotes in here from this article just because they're so darn good, and I worried that I wouldn't say it well. So I'm going to now give you a quote from our authors. Quote, "The medical model holds that there are decreases in quality of life associated with having autism. There are decreases.
Don't you take it again?
Sorry. Okay. And they said, quote, "The medical model holds that when there are decreases in quality of life associated with having autism, they are primarily caused by autism. By contrast, the neurodiversity perspective holds that when there are decreases in quality of life associated with being autistic, they are primarily caused by an interaction between the autistic person and their environment."
That seems so much more like us.
The second one.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Right? Yeah. Well, I think it very well can be, right? So a lot of the things that are discussed within this article are pretty easily subsumed within the way in which we can practice if we are already practicing compassionately. Mm-hmm. And that's why this is a great article for any behavioral analyst to get in there and look at. It's going to give you a lot to think about, but ultimately it's digestible for us. So like I said, ABA is often associated with the medical model, and it's going to be hard to get away from this in that our insurance payers, right, our school systems are all kind of based in this model. So like that is a little bit of a reality, at least in some contexts. However, it does make sense that this would make proponents of the neurodiversity movement critical of ABA. So our main question for this paper from our authors is it appropriate to teach clients with autism to behave as if they were neurotypical? And that's like the crux of it. Jackie.
I know.
Sorry.
You know what? It's fine.
You were combining juxtaposition.
Yeah.
And crux.
But I like jux better. So.
I like cruxtaposition.
Cruxtaposition.
That's what I'm going to use from now on. Yeah. So that was what they're trying to figure out, right? Because that's like where the rubber meets the road in terms of this whole behavioral symptomatic list that needs to be changed. And for us, they had 3 scenarios that they kind of used to walk us through this. So the first scenario is Avery, who engages in some type of dangerous self-injurious behavior. The second is Alex, who engages in hand flapping in school. And the third is Ace, who engages in hand flapping in private. And they give us these scenarios so we can walk through what the argument is on the neurodiversity perspective side, basically on how and if we should intervene for this behavior. So the first one is self-injurious behavior. And our authors tell us that the argument here is not really against attempting to decrease self-injury as it is causing harm in this scenario, but there are potential arguments that could be made against the methods that are employed. And that totally makes sense, right? We could say that in lots of contexts if we think about those 3 branches of social validity as put forth by Wolf back in the day. But a best practice approach here is going to involve evidence-based practice to minimize risk of harm. They quote someone named Schketti from 2019 and seem to support that author's approach. That other author said dialectical behavior therapy might be a way to go. I don't know enough about that to comment. And FCT. So we do know about FCT. That's something that's well within our wheelhouse, right? And of course, if someone's engaging in dangerous behavior, we want to figure out why that's happening and teach them appropriate communication responses instead. But they also said we focus too much on behavior, right? Basically. So we need to be thinking more holistically about the environment in which this behavior is occurring. So let's say we're seeing a lot of self-injury because Avery is being asked to work at a neurotypical pace or level. And that is, for them, for whatever reason, just too much to be asking. So we're seeing a lot of frustration on their part, avoidance behavior in the form of self-injury that's allowing them to escape from the task. If we're just focusing on the self-injury, we're really just missing the mark here, right? So we need to back up and look at whether what they're being asked to do is appropriate, and can we not instead maybe make modifications to that? So that makes a lot of sense, right? And then when we talk about that social model of disability, as I said before, if the person's experience and the environment that they're attempting to be in is a mismatch, then that may be why they're feeling disabled in that setting. So if we can make changes to that environment, in this case, lowering that what's being asked of them, then we might be able to fix this situation more easily. The second one is like the most challenging one, as perhaps you would have guessed by hearing these 3 examples, the hand flapping in school, which was the Alex scenario. And this one is challenging because it does kind of fall in the middle. It's got a lot of complexity in terms of how we might need to address this behavior, because it's an issue in the fact that the school and the educational setting, as it's typically established, discourages this behavior. It falls outside of the neurotypical norm. But it
really doesn't, right? But it does, but it doesn't, right? Like, I see kids, moving themselves all over the place, right? But if it's, grand, right, then it does. But if it's, smaller...
There's an amount of fidgeting or movement
Yeah.
that is going to be accepted by different educators in different ways.
Depending on who it is, right? But when I read that one, I was like...
And I think there's a sort of a hidden bias. If a student in your classroom has an IEP and they're moving a lot, it's because of who they are as an autistic or as someone with an intellectual disability. Whereas if they don't have an IEP,
Oh,
you might let it slide. Or if they're doing well most of the time and it's not getting in your way, it's not a problem. But if it's bothering you, then it's a problem.
Yeah.
Sure. Yes. And, everyone has like some level of stereotypic behavior they engage in. But if you are perhaps a little more tuned into the potential like social punishers that are involved, then the form of your stereotypic behavior may have come underneath the control of the environment that you're in. And so look a little more typical, basically. So behavior that really falls outside of that realm into atypical is the one that's going to get flagged. Our authors, I gave us another quote just because, once again, they said it's so great. So here you go. First, focusing on hand flapping obscures the role of educational design decisions in Alex's academic experiences. If the repetitive behaviors characteristic of autism were seen as normal variants of student behavior within the public education context, coursework and classrooms would likely be designed in ways that made hand flapping compatible with achieving desired learning outcomes. Focusing exclusively on Alex's repetitive hand flapping as the target for intervention threatens to obscure the fact that their hand flapping only interferes with academic progress because educational environments are designed in ways that privilege neurotypicality. Okay, so that, again, summarizes, I think, a lot of what we are already identifying with, right? So it's an issue because everyone thinks it's an issue. And if it were perhaps a larger percentage of the population that we're engaging in this, we wouldn't necessarily recognize it as problematic. It might be something that teachers are more familiar with and could incorporate a little bit better. Now, the second point is important because this is the one that often comes up when we say, should we address stereotypy? Commonly, people will say, only if it interferes with learning, right? So the second point is important. I'm again quoting from our authors. Second, the degree to which hand flapping interferes with Alex's academic progress depends in part on the existence of normative rate of academic progress. The abolitionist neurodiversity critique raises the question, how do we decide the rate at which Alex is expected to learn? Academic and social benchmarks are largely set by reference to Alex's neurotypical peers. Yet proponents of the neurodiversity perspective will likely view this emphasis on neurotypical performance as a form of prejudice. End quote. See, there was no way I was going to say that as well.
No, you weren't.
Right? Because they just bam, knocked it out of the park.
A little bit of a slap in the face, and I love it.
Yeah. Right. So again, like we often hear, well, if it interferes with learning, then we should redirect it. But perhaps our expectation on what the rate of learning is part of an ableist perspective. Right. Now, they also come back on the other side, and it's actually in a footnote. Where did I put it in here? Don't know. Put it in here somewhere.
This is tricky territory.
I lost it.
It's right here in the notes. I see it. I'll read it just because
go ahead.
To time. I'm not going to do the quote, but really looking at the idea that if you're thinking about neurotypical behavior as normative is morally problematic, and you should not be doing that. However, it's also morally problematic to think that, well, because they're autistic, we wouldn't expect them to do as well as their neurotypical peers. So again, it's not about one or the other. It's about individualized exploration of the strengths and challenges that that individual is facing, and then coming up with a rate that seems fair for what they are doing based on what they are interested in, based on what they have access to or have had access to, and then coming up with a rate from there rather than either or. They can't meet that rate, it's not fair, or, well, they should meet that rate because that's where they are.
Awesome. Good. Yes. Thank you. Okay, so
ABA is the best for that because we're really good at individualizing things.
Yeah. All right, so overall, they say hand flapping should not be pathologized. If we're addressing it, it should depend on why hand flapping is occurring, right? So the same thing, if the environment is stressing them out, right, then we should be looking at that as a whole. And then finally, hand flapping in private. This one is a little bit easier in that they say if we're treating it as an issue, then that we're pathologizing this behavior as it's neurodivergent instead of neurotypical. So it's really hard to justify intervention in this regard. One thing that is, I think, important in this scenario that they brought up is that it's ACE. ACE's parents want to change the behavior. So that does bring in a whole other topic of discussion that they just barely bring up here, but I think is warranted, right? Is what do you do when parents request something that you maybe identify as opposed to a neurodiversity affirming approach, and that we'd have to save that convo for later, but it is potentially like a challenge in this whole context.
It probably will be, right?
In the future. Yeah, we're just maybe not there yet in this conversation in our field. Yes, for sure. And then just to close us out here, there's like so much good stuff in this article, but the next piece of it is they take us on a whole pathway here with a parallel between thinking about AAVE speakers, which is African American Vernacular English, as learning to code switch to standard English in a school setting. And they say if to do this well and properly, it should be established for the speakers that neither approach to English is better. They're just different. But there also has to be an acknowledgement that society at large discriminates against AAVE. So knowing when and how to use standard English is going to be advantageous in some settings. And, perhaps the ultimate ideal would be to get rid of the fact that AAVE is discriminated against, but we do also want to or need to prepare people to operate within the reality that they live in. So we could use the same argument for teaching some aspects of neuronormative behavior to neurodivergent individuals, keeping the focus on learning to discriminate between contexts as the key point there, and in trying to ensure that we are not treating neurodivergent behavior as discriminated against or less than in the course of these conversations. There's more that's discussed here, but you guys should just go check out the article to finish it off because it's really, really good. And the last thing I'm going to say is that they say ABA can be used to increase or decrease virtually any behavior independent of a moral viewpoint. However, quote, behavior analysis owes some account of the boundaries of appropriate goals for intervention. So we have a lot of power. Part of that power that we're using should also be to guide behavior analysts in this decision-making process.
Excellent. All right. Let's head into dissemination station. So I think we went over a lot of different concepts and not exactly arguments, but lines of discussion. I think in this episode, just in looking in these two papers, as well as some background information, and to some extent when we're looking at ableism and the medical model of disability, what I would certainly recommend in terms of talking to other behavior analysts about how we can make shifts is recognizing when a medical model does or does not make sense. And I think when we're talking about the vast majority of disabilities, if not every disability, the medical model is not really the appropriate model we'd be looking into. We should really focusing on the social model. And in terms of supporting that work, one would really be thinking back to your cultural competence. Are you including or participatory community research? Are we including the people that we purport to care for in every aspect of the discussion, or are we making assumptions based on our histories and how we think things should be or how they should be done? And this can be very hard. Certainly, if you've been practicing for a long time, I think it's very easy to say, oh, this is what you do. And when you take that step back, say, well, why do we do it that way? And it's not like you come up with, oh, because there's so much research to support X, Y, Z. It's sort of, that's kind of just how it's always been. Or that seems to make the most sense to who? To me. And I think if we all did a little bit more of that reflection in the planning of our treatments, we really would, without standing up and saying to neurodiversity advocates, no, we're not that kind of ABA anymore. We'd actually be demonstrating, I think, the type of reform that many neurodiversity advocates are continuing to look for. I mean, we have a science that's about the relationship between behavior and the environment. We should totally be on the side of folks who are saying, hey, the environment is a lot of the problem that individuals are having. There's no reason that we can't be totally in on that conversation in productive ways. So, again,
one thing I think this is far more than dissemination station can handle, but I want
it's bursting at the seams.
But I want people to think about it is not just our practice, right? But our practice right now is tied very closely to the medical model due to insurance funding, right? And so those insurance companies are paying services based out of medical necessity.
Yes.
Right? And then when you write those service plans, you can kind of write them in a neuroaffirming way, but because of the medical model, if you write it in a completely neuroaffirming way, they're going to reject your treatment.
Yeah.
Right? Because you do have to identify deficits, unfortunately. And so I think the question should be going forward, how do we change that system?
Maybe that's our code switch moment.
Right?
We do
that's
the code
what Graeber
switching,
and
right?
Graeber
Just like
say.
Graeber and Graeber.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, then if a autistic individual gets a hold of the medical model, like report, right? How are they going to feel when you are saying all of this one thing, and then they read the medical model, right? When it's full of deficits, and the neuroaffirming one is not. This is something I've heard specifically on Reddit. I've been following all of these.
I'm just curious, is that something that you're not allowed to share?
No, you
with
can.
The client?
No,
I would just be very transparent
be
about.
transparent.
Yeah,
right.
I have to write it this way, or they will not pay for me to help you.
Right, but what I would love to see is how can we change that? How can we change the system that it isn't a deficit-based approach?
Oh God, we're going back to our episode on
I know.
political advocacy. No.
I know, this is what I've been thinking about just...
Personally, folks, if you haven't listened to that episode, I just don't want to be a political advocate.
Yeah, it's a great one, but I think like in order for behavior analysis to fully subsume neuroaffirming care, right, in all aspects, and change our language around how we perceive autism and perceive deficits, right, that may not be deficits, but more call them adaptive skills, right? We need to change all of our language about that, right? Because we can code switch, but it's going to be harder for some people, right? They're going to fully be in the medical model, like, you have autism, here are all the things that I need to fix about you, right? But then try to be neuroaffirming, or you're going to be in the neuroaffirming camp, and it's going to be really, because they're very different, right? And so I think ultimately the long-term plan should be to change the system. That's what I think.
Jackie.
Because it's just I think it's very difficult because, like...
Well, in the meantime, while we wait for those glacial years to go, why don't you talk to your trainees about some of these things? Do you talk about what a medical model is? When you're going over paperwork, do you describe, whether you're in maybe an educational setting or whether you're in an insurance-based payment setting?
It's hard.
Are you talking about why is it this way and how this way isn't the only or best way? It just happens to currently be the way, and how does that play into how does that play into our work?
Parents,
right? This is actually a great way to get this conversation in with parents as well,
right?
To make this distinction for them,
right? In a few of the treatment plans that I have been reviewing, right, I'm like, ooh, this sounds too, like, it sounds like
icky. I mean,
right?
At this point, after you've read some of these things,
it's icky. But it's very difficult to write it in a way that's neuroaffirming, but then also acceptable to insurance, right? And so I think we need to be having those conversations, both with the insurance companies, with the parents, and with our trainees, so that the new behavior analysts that are coming up aren't thinking in the way of the medical model because that's what they're writing, right?
Yeah.
You can't expect someone to code switch until they know how to code switch.
Absolutely.
Right?
Right. Yes.
And so you can't expect a new behavior analyst to do that, I don't think.
Until they've had these
these
information provided to them.
Right.
Yeah.
And a lot of practice.
Yeah. And that's all of us, right?
Right.
You don't know until you know, and then you can do better.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is why we wanted to have this convo.
Oh my gosh. Is that why we're here?
Yeah.
I'm just kidding.
All right. Well, let's wrap up the show with a little pairing. We did it. We got it all. We're done with the medical model ableism.
Nailed it.
We solved it all.
Okay.
Let's go to pairings.
It's time for pairings, everybody. Pairings is where I tell you about past episodes that you might want to check out if you liked this episode. And so I have several to share with you for today. I am going to first of all recommend our neurodiversity series that we did recently, where we talked about neurodiversity, and then we also invited on several different neurodivergent guests to share their perspectives and research. So those are episodes 268, 280, and 281. Also, since Rob just brought it up, you could check out ABA and Public Policy, which is episode 274. Our previous episode on ableism was episode 295, where we talked about ableism in schools. I also always love to recommend episode 236, which is Assent and Self-Determination. And then finally, very recently, we talked about vaccines and autism in episode 300. Because there's an article in there, Alvik Harju 2023, which I would have included in this episode, except we'd already talked about it. And they review the medical model of disability extremely well. So you could also go check that article out. I also like to recommend a snack to go with the episode. Today's snack is popsicles and ice cream. Why, Jackie?
Because you're sick.
No.
Oh.
Because it's too hot in here?
Yeah, because it's so hot in here.
Recording room.
It is
hot.
so hot. I had to change my whole outfit.
We need some summertime snacks.
Yeah, we really do. But those are things I eat when I'm sick.
Oh.
And the medical
Or
model.
if you have your tonsils out. Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah, I didn't mean it that way.
One way to think about the medical model I always is this a problem inside me that if I don't fix it, I might die? And if the answer is yes, go to the medical model. If the answer is like, no, then maybe it's not the medical model.
You went,
But some mental health issues are very serious.
Yeah.
So
I'm not discounting that you can't use a little medical model, a little social model,
Okay.
a little both.
pick and choose.
okay.
Anyway, thank
Great.
you.
Whatever works for you is an individual.
Pairings. Please enjoy.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for listening to ABA Inside Track. We really appreciate it. If you haven't, please subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts or wherever you like to get your podcast. You can also find us online at abainsidetrack.com, where you can find links to all of our previous episodes, links to the articles that we discussed in these episodes, and places to get CEs, like a CE you might want for this episode by going to abainsidetrack.com and putting in your second secret code word, which is EON, E-O-N. It's 1,000 years, right? It's a long chunk of time.
Ages and ages of time.
So long. EON.
So long, Eon.
So long. We also have a Patreon page, patreon.com/ABA Inside Track, where you can find even more episodes. You can get all of these episodes a week ahead of time. You can get access to exclusive episodes, such as our book club episodes. We actually, if you are interested in this topic, we recently, or around when this comes out, we should have our most recent spring book club on divergent minds, which goes very much into the neurodiversity movement. And we're big fans of that book. So you can check that out, but only if you are a patron at the $10 up level. You can also join us at the $5 and up level to get access to free CEs and our listener choice episodes and other discounts as well. So again, that's patreon.com/ABA Inside Track. Do you want more neurodiversity books next year? Well, sign up today. We also want to say a couple other big thanks. We want to say big thanks to Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro, outro music, Kyle Sturry for our interstitial music, and Dan Thabit of the Podcast Doctors for his amazing editing work. We'll be back next week with another fun-filled episode, but until then, keep responding. Bye!
Bye!
Bye.